about Indigenous resilience, that from a strengths-based perspective, if I just stop the discussion with the negative outcomes we see, in my opinion, the job would be half done and dangerously so. Instead, I think it's important that you can appreciate the context so that the resilience itself is all the more meaningful. Now, there is some discussion, especially in recent years, about how the word resilience in itself, like it'd be nice to never be called resilient again in your life, because by definition, resilience entails adversity. Resilience or resiliency, whether it's the verb or the noun or the adjective, excuse me, the adjective or the noun, both of these are contextual, that they have to have adversity for the resilience to happen. It's been called grit, gumption, other things in other times, but one could say there are those who might not be very resilient in the world because they haven't had the adversity required to grow that muscle. If you're someone who's got a resilient bone like me, muscle, bone, pick one, gosh knows what it would have been like if that hadn't been the case. Thank God I made it, because I wouldn't be here if not. But the science behind resilience, both socially and scientifically, is kind of where I want to take the conversation this week. And for me, the way to be able to show this to you is to get you to interact with tangible examples of living Indigenous resilience. And so, no spoilers. But while if you come on Zoom, you'll be able to participate because someone's going to carry a laptop around to the groups, you won't actually be able to get full credit on Thursday's quiz assignment. It'll be a reflection. And so being in the room and being able to participate is like linked together with full credit. So the most you can get will be 4.5 out of 5 on the assignment. But even beyond that little half point, which really in the big scheme of things isn't much, it's a very tactile and sensory experience. And I am happy to say this year, I didn't have all the stuff I wanted, so we might have a special food guest at the last day of class, but at minimum, there'll even be things to taste. So yeah, if you had fun on Halloween, but want it to be scholastic, come on Thursday. You're gonna have a good time. And yeah, I'm incentivizing it for grades, but trust me, you're gonna wanna come. I would say it's most people's favorite day in class, mine included. Now, does anyone have any questions or announcements before we jump into content for the day? Any cool stuff going on campus? Go ahead.
Today we're having a event called Positivity, where we're gonna have tea, board games, and some cookies. So if you want to come, that or that. Live prayer.
Yes. Yeah, I did. I posted it. It's up there. I hope. What is it? You guys are providing warm things, but BYO mug, right? Is the Ooh. Perfect. Awesome. Awesome. Does anyone here have like mug collections, or anyone like mugs? Anybody? I feel like it's one of those things for souvenirs. I've been lucky enough to travel a lot in my life, and I'm a hoarder, so I buy stuff for me too. But more often than not, I'm bringing stuff back for others. But the things that I bring myself to kind of add to the travel collection are fridge magnets and mugs. But I'm really picky about my mug. It's got to be like, someone called it Titanic size mugs. Like, so these the ones that fit like half a pot of coffee in them. But I hate it when you have a huge mug and like a little tiny handle. It's just like, why are you're setting me up for failure here? So I like the big mug with the big handle, like I was a 6'6" brawny. You know who Paul Bunyan is. But yeah, so today is, I thank you for that announcement. And I think, what is it? We've officially switched into warm drink weather. I don't know about you guys. Yeah, right? I've been wearing sweats and hoodies. I even enjoyed some hot cider recently. But I turned on my fireplace too, but it's like you couldn't do that even a couple of weeks ago. Weren't we had that freak like 100-degree day out of nowhere? Just stay ready. But you can feel it in the air. The mountains are close. So hopefully we're in the clear. Come to check that out. If you want more details, the information is on our announcements page. Now, as I said, today we're going to go over the content for Indigenous resilience. Thursday is going to be the experience of Indigenous resilience. But thank you guys also for your flexibility as I was kind of trying to figure out what the last reading would be for this week. I am very happy to say that in previous versions of this class, I had other things assigned, but nothing ever really fit. It never really like helped make the point that I wanted for the week. And sometimes, especially with things like this, where we're like on the front lines of such a new topic, that's because it doesn't exist yet. But since the last time we talked, there was a book published called Invisible No More, Voices from Native America. And oh, I have to make that italic, such a stickler. This is a publication by the First Nations Development Institute. They were the people responsible for the Gather film earlier this year that we watched. And I remember I showed you guys pictures of me and two of the stars from Gather. I don't know. I was like, I don't know if I'm going to find it. I might find it while we're doing I got a video for you guys, because God willing, the tech will comply. But I got to go and meet all of the First Nations people, and they were like talking about this cool, like they were gave us something to read, and it kept talking about this report citing all these things. And I'm like, where the fuck is this book? It doesn't exist. What do you mean? And they're like, that's because we just printed it. It's like hot off the presses, and we've got a copy for all of you guys. So I just got that, and I found this essay that is going to be very cool hype material because it talks about salmon, amongst other things. Salmon and acorns, like coming from the Gary Oak, are super important to my people. Acorns, broadly speaking, are one of the traditional foods of California Indians at large. I don't know the number. I was once a forester. Fun fact, I was on a state-winning forestry team. High school is a hell of a thing. But there's like 20 different oak trees in the state, and a huge number of oak trees, as well as just California fauna or flora, excuse me, plants and vegetation. Although animals too, the fauna, actually have fire as a huge important part of their reproduction process. And this is obviously maybe counterintuitive from a lot of the things that like the Forest Service or Smokey the Bear, only you can prevent forest fires. And yeah, be preventing forest fires. Don't take from class, more forest fires. That's not for you to do. But the idea that fire itself is inherently bad or hasn't actually been instrumental to essentially crafting the California that was here when settlers first came, and is an instrumental part of maintaining that California from a biological perspective, environmental perspective. Fire was the backdrop. I think I've read the statistic that 90% of California vegetation actually has fire as part of its reproductive cycle. There are different kinds of trees, for example, that will not produce their seeds unless they experience fire. And as we learned in the readings, fire in the Coast Salish Three Sisters, the Gary Oak tree, as well as the camas little bulbs, the flowers that they come from, both of these require a certain kind of like plant dynamic. I don't know if you guys have ever had to mow a lawn or been responsible for any kind of yard, especially in a place where things grow well and it's like peak season. Give that fucker 2 weeks. It's trying to become forest, right? It's growing, it's getting long. First you get long grass, then you get bushes, then you get trees. That's the way of nature, actually, is to eventually just get like hugely snarled up jungle level, which if that's the vibe, that's cool. But when people assume that the landscapes, especially like the positive parts, like prairies or certain kind of land formations, the way trees grew here and not there, there's often an impression that this just happened by happenstance, that it wasn't actually something managed through a purposeful and human hand. And that is actually more often the case than not when you look at California as a whole. And so as you learn, though, that it's not just California, that this is an experience in other areas as well. And why I like this story is that my people, not to always be you rock this, you rock that, although they say that's how Yurocks are, so on brand. But we would most accurately be described as the bottom part of the salmon people, as opposed to the uppermost part of kind of the Californian, well, we have acorns in common, certain like basketry practices, living patterns, or just things like that that were shaped on your food source or your climate. California as a whole, you kind of see certain trends, but there's kind of a geographical dividing line whereby people north of a certain line would actually be lumped into more of the indigenous cultures that you find in like Oregon, all the way up to Vancouver. Whereas Pomo country or Miwok, Yuki, the ones we see here locally, they would share a lot more in common. But that basically goes up to where the Redwood Belt starts. If anyone's ever been to Mendocino County, anyone in that part of the world even? Stay safe if you go that way. But it's also, you see it when you're driving on the 101. You can actually see the flora and fauna start to change. And then all of a sudden, you're quote unquote behind the emerald curtain. So that's where I'm from. And you guys will get to learn and maybe even taste more about that on Thursday. No more spoilers. But in the essay, we learn about an example where Gary Oak, Camas, or Camus, I'm not sure how to say it, and salmon are essentially a Coast Salish version of the Three Sisters. Now, has anyone ever heard about the Three Sisters in other examples? They describe the one that's most known in the reading. So even if that's the first time you're hearing it, this would be a cool time to tell me. What did they tell us about the Three Sisters? Oh, no. Is somebody
There's no put in it.
podcast? Hold on. It's always awkward. Somebody was ordering Starbucks once when their microphone went on in class, and it's like, you know, what can you do? Get me one? I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm seeing some notes about people who aren't gonna be here on Thursday. If you're not here on Thursday and you really, really care about the activity, send me an email and I might, often it's a popular enough thing, sometimes I bring things into the next week, but if people are like over it, I don't. It hasn't been that case yet, but yeah, send me a note and I'll make sure I give you a taste at least. Now, yeah, back to the Three Sisters though. Has anyone ever heard of the Three Sisters? Or even the example they give in the text? What does it mean, the Three Sisters? Maybe. I'm gonna give this one to you guys. I was like, it's one of those weeks. So the Three Sisters, traditionally speaking, has been corn, squash, and beans. It's because, I mean, we didn't need Western science to tell us why these guys fucked with each other, or ladies, excuse me. But we've proven through Western science that actually these three things going together weren't just a matter of structure, because from the outside, there's a very functional layer here that the corn grows tall, which allows the beans to like spiral up as a vine will, and then the squash grows on the ground really low and keeps the ground moist and happy for everyone else who's growing too. And so these things all grow together on a very functional level. It makes sense. But if you are, do we have anyone who's like environmental studies minors? Or I don't think so. I was like, you guys are mostly psych and soc peeps. But in the off chance you were, you might already know that there's things like in beans called rhizomes. They're in their nodules. And essentially like all plant life, all life on Earth requires, right? I didn't take chemistry, so this is about to get real rough. But they all require certain basic chemical compounds, right? Nitrogen is one of them. There's different kinds of nitrogen. The soil, generally speaking, is not directly accessible to plants, even though they're sitting side by side, roots and soil. They need something that helps them process the nitrogen from the surrounding soil. And so sometimes we provide it through fertilizer, but there's plants, largely beans. I don't want to be like, I think this is why beans make us fart, just speculation. But they take the nitrogen and make it into an accessible version for other plants. And so beans, as a large or rhizome bearing things, all plants love them because they help them out. And so there's a symbiotic layer there that the traditional example of the three sisters is borrowed to show how the Gary oak, the camas, and the salmon all go together. Now, what the unifying tool, though, is that fire is a tool of quote unquote gentle care, which as someone who's always saying I do gentle professoring, and if Lord forbid I have a kid, it'd be gentle parenting, maybe. Gentle care. I love that idea of fire. Maybe I'll be that kind of parent. Fire as gentle care. And it's kind of one of the last points they make, that when we talk about these beautiful landscapes, like iconic places in the United States, people will say natural and untouched wilderness. And actually, it's a huge omission of the indigenous peoples who usually stewarded those areas such that they looked as they did when people first came. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't a happy circumstance. It wasn't even their God making it perfect for them. It was our diligent, constant work, our role as stewards. And in many cases, on a functional level, we had to feed ourselves. We needed all of these things to flourish so that we could meet our own needs. But we also learn a little bit in this reading and in other weeks about how much these animals and like the responsibilities to them are actually not just optional. They're like baked in core tenets, core beliefs of their life systems, their worldviews. It's as real as the air they breathe. And so we learn about Salmon Boy. We don't have Salmon Boy in our stories. We have a different story of how salmon came to be. But either way, in all of the peoples who have salmon in common, or in another parallel, when we learned about buffalo on the plains, there's always this underlying theme that there are traditional responsibilities to our non-human relatives. In this case, the traditional responsibility to the salmon and to the ocean. And I don't know about you guys, hopefully you did the reading, but if you do, or when you do, there is a part that talks about how in their ceremonies, they just always had the teaching that at a certain time of year, they were supposed to burn a certain plant and leave it in the water because that would help the salmon find their way home. And, it's actually really rare in the fish world to have something that starts in the river and lives its life in the ocean and then comes back to that very same creek off that very same river on that very same mountain to have its babies and spawn in that area so that they will keep that tradition going. In many ways, like we don't even fucking know how they find it. Like that, ask the salmon, we'll never know. We put something on them, we know they get there. We don't know how. But the more we're learning, it does have to do with like something inside them, as well as their ability to smell their way back home. And so the idea that we as a people would have been gifted that responsibility is so sacred, but also such a profound responsibility because of all the ways we have been unable to fulfill those things since contact. That it was almost because of our tie to the land and the responsibility we had to it that we were targeted. And so that was one of the first things they tried to sever. I'm hoping this is ringing some bells from the week on food sovereignty, because more often than not, the food, we could not harvest. It wouldn't have been in line with our teachings if there wasn't surplus. We have stories of We know what it means to be without and things so that we would have what we needed in a balanced and appropriate way. Now, obviously that was different based on the biome you're speaking about, but as we look at larger, maybe lessons for social change, I don't think it's any accident that we see this theme of traditional responsibilities to the land and to the non-human actors therein. But we also know that this runs right up against a lot of Western ways of being, ways of knowing. And so even if we've always known it a certain way, very rarely are our teachings taken seriously. We'll come back to this on our Tribal Justice Week, but this is also evident when we look, just largely speaking, that there's almost a worldview clash between the idea that you have responsibilities in this world versus you have rights in this world. And that is one of the core differences between many Western worldviews and indigenous worldviews. That they're, if you think of the right to, what is it, the right to the pursuit of happiness, the Bill of Rights, all these kinds of things. That is an ethos of individual rights that goes all the way back to like Greece, Plato, Frog Rocks, as I've called them. For us, our teachings didn't come from a place of humans over nature and that humans have a fundamental right to shit. In fact, we have responsibilities. When you come into this world, you are born with certain responsibilities and expectations to the land and to the collective. And if you honor these things, it's not that the collective is more important than you, but that these things are balanced and in tandem, that by honoring the collective and your responsibilities therein, you as an individual have your needs met and can attain the other things in life because you're not always worried about meeting your own individual needs. That is now a collective task and a collective burden. Some people have said, Western society really fucked it up because if we wanted to, we could all just be eating our favorite foods and like making art. That's what a lot of indigenous people did. They met their basic needs in a way that wasn't going to make the earth burn. And then they made baller art. Who knows? Maybe we'll live that way again. But without honoring the knowledge that lives in what they call human libraries, arguably we won't ever be able to do that. And that is very much this Western bias against oral histories, that even though we tribally know how much knowledge goes with every elder, that no matter how many times we talk to them, how many recordings we could ever hope to have, when they pass, entire worlds go with them. There is a huge bias to like recognize those as legitimate data points, and that it's only ever when they prove things through Western science that the things we've always known to be true are then given some credence. So for example, they talk about how, I love this, I'm sure people have heard of, I was thinking it must be something to do with cores from the earth, like how they geology will take a core out and it can tell you about all the stuff that's happened, or ice. Sometimes it happens in ice. In this instance, they're actually looking at paleo pollen. What would paleo pollen be from? Pun intended. Mixed pollen, guys. Softball. Say it all together. Oh, that's tricky. You're right. The flowers make it. I was going to say bees, but the flowers make the pollen. Oh, that was good because I would have accepted bees. Let's say they're together, but you're right. The pollen comes from the plants, and I told you that a huge amount of California species use fire to propagate. And so we're able to show in that analysis that humans have been inducing cultural fire regimens. I think, is that regimens or regimes? I can't remember which. I think it's a typo. Either way, they've been using fire, culturally speaking, in a way that preserved the Gary Oak and the Camas prairies. I had to go edit that for 3,800 years. So almost 4 millennia, they can prove that we have indigenously been using fire in this area. I did extend it to a we because I'm going to show you how my people do it, shockingly, in a couple of slides. But does that shock anyone? Like, it's been 4,000 years? It's like a long time. It's a lot longer than what we've been doing when it comes to fire suppression. That's like 100 years, 200 years in some places. The implications for that are pretty severe. And we're gonna talk about fire more in a couple of slides, but before we do that, I don't know about you guys, but after reading about the Camas root, I found myself wondering what that was, and just like what it would be like. So I found a video. We're gonna take a look at it together, hopefully without any trouble. We're gonna bring it up here.
Looking for new. I'm always looking for new ways to improve my primitive survival skills. So this year I'm doing a wild food challenge where I'm gathering, hunting, and fishing as much wild food as possible to incorporate into my diet. A great starting point for this challenge is to study the different types of wild foods that Native Americans relied on to survive. Here in Western Oregon, one of the most important food sources was camas bulb. Where I live in the Willamette Valley of Western Oregon, we have 2 of the 6 species of camas found growing in North America. This includes common camas and the greater camas. Both species of this attractive purple flower were an important food source for the Kalapuya Indians, who would routinely burn the Willamette Valley on an annual basis in order to promote vast fields of camas in the wet prairie environments. Before I show you how to harvest and eat camas, a word of caution. That is, you need to be able to positively identify this plant. Flowers can vary in color from purple to blue to white. However, there is a deadly lookalike out there known as death camas, whose bulb is very toxic and could easily be confused with regular camas. I know of several fields where death camas is growing right alongside regular camas, and in digging each plant, I was able to compare the bulbs, which are very similar in appearance. When digging camas, you need to make sure that there's no death camas growing in the area. I prefer to harvest camas bulb in late summer and early fall after the plant has gone to seed and is dormant. Camas is one of the first flowers to bloom in the spring, and by January already has a shoot growing out of the bulb. Traditionally, Native Americans harvested camas using a digging stick. However, I like to use the spike antler of an elk. The bulbs of the camas are located about 6 to 8 inches below the surface of the ground. A good size of camas bulb to harvest is about the size of a golf ball. It can take many years for camas bulb to grow to the proper size, so smaller camas bulbs should be placed back in the loose dirt. I have found that after digging in the same area for several years, camas production can actually be improved by this disturbance when harvested in a sustainable manner. In its raw form, camas bulb is basically inedible. It is very bland tasting, and it is so slimy that it feels like you put a slug in your mouth. Camas bulb also contains a complex carbohydrate known as inulin, which can be very difficult to digest, can result in stomach ache and gas. Early settlers wrote about the strength of wind in the Indian hut, and Lewis and Clark described how every man was nearly sick with a stomach ache after consuming camas for the first time. To deal with this problem, the inulin in the camas bulbs can be slowly cooked and converted into more digestible simple sugars. This was traditionally done by steaming the bulbs in a pit oven using hot stones. I began by heating a number of stones in a campfire, and then rolled these heated stones into a pit. I then placed a layer of grass and thimbleberry leaves on the heated stones and placed my camas bulbs on the layer of leaves. The final step is to place another layer of leaves on your bulbs and then cover this with heated rocks and dirt. The heat from the rocks and the steam from the wet dirt and leaves will slowly cook your camas bulbs. Traditionally, the camas ovens were much larger than the ones I'm showing here. After one day, my rocks cooled and I dug up the camas bulbs, but was disappointed to find that they were not fully cooked. After one day in the oven, the bulbs were still white. So I started the whole process over again and ended up cooking these bulbs for 3 full days. It was fascinating to see just how long camas bulbs take to cook. After 3 days, I had the golden caramel color I was desiring. Here you can compare how camas bulb looks after cooking for 1 and 3 full days. After 3 days, the complex carbohydrates in the inulin has broken down into simple sugars, which make the camas bulb much sweeter and more digestible. Once fully cooked, camas bulbs can be dried and stored for a long period of time. Camas bulbs were a very important food source for Native Americans living in the Pacific Northwest, and they served as an item of trade. I look forward to using camas bulbs in my wild food challenge.
This is how AI optimizes my skip. This meeting got canceled. Hooray! We really want to go anyway.
I've never had that feeling. Feels attacked by my ads. So I'm gonna keep the lights off because we're gonna watch another thing. But in one hand, that was for my own curiosity as well. But I wanted to point out a cool parallel to something we learned about earlier this semester. Camas, much like acorns, both represent kinds of food that were like huge staples, right, to like entire peoples and civilizations, but without like significant preparation, were actually toxic or at least inedible. And so camas is another example of that. And I thought it almost looked like an onion when it was done, but it sounded like it was a potato adjacent thing. So like a weird potato onion, which I'd love if I was like, I might have to try one, but they're sweet. I don't know about that. But in either case, I always think when you learn about these kinds of foods and the food prep that was needed, I just always wonder, it's like, well, who figured that out? Like what person was hanging, playing with roots and thought, if I cook these in the ground for 3 or 4 days, maybe we can eat them then. And, you know, scientifically speaking, one could say there's an empirical method that one did, da-da-da-da. But I think if I were to pose that question to any elder, they would say, we didn't figure it out. We were given these teachings. We were told that this is what we needed to do to honor this place, and that if we did these things, it would take care of us. But in order for that to be the case, you had to do these other things as well. So it wasn't actually a process of like human innovation that came to this knowledge, but rather these are teachings that for many indigenous peoples are like core to their very way of being and knowing, which in some ways is a good answer. But the Western scientist in my mind can't help be like, but really though, who told you to cook them for 3 days? And when my Aquarius moon says the aliens, it's not happy. But somebody gave us those teachings at minimum. Now, one of the other things that we kind of are now scientifically finding ways to prove, it's the importance of fire to all of these places. And something, let's see here, you can't see it because we don't have the slides. Where are the slides? Should I close them? Oh, there they are. Something I grew up my whole life with my dad saying was that, are we on the same page? I'm hoping Zoom can say it. The worst thing the Forest Service ever did was fire suppression. And he grew up in a very rural part of the world where the Karuk tribe is based out of. I've mentioned them before because they're the ones who gave us our name. The Yurok essentially means the people down there in the Karuk language. And they are our upriver relatives. We come together for our ceremonies, but we have drastically different languages and somewhat different climates, even though there's a lot in common. The Karuk were closer to the Trinity Alps, and so they had a lot more kind of snow and seasons to deal with, whereas my people are from the ocean, right? So there's more of a temperate fog crawler vibe. Now, the Six Rivers National Forest is one of the forests that now encompasses all of the Karuk's former territory. And they, like other tribes, were effectively kept out of being able to maintain or manage that land for much of the last 150 years since contact. But in recent decades, they finally are pulling their head out because, Smokey the Bear and a lot of Forest Service, even to this day, it's about fire suppression, that we just can't have fires ever. Bad. There's no good fire. That could not be farther from the truth. And actually, by suppressing fire that is supposed to happen annually or seasonally or somewhat regularly, that's when you get these super fires. Never mind the climate change and the fact that everything's hotter and windier than it ever was before. Just the very fact that you're not allowing fire to come and to clean and purge the things that are no longer needed, you're going to just get more and more fuel that builds up, such that when it inevitably does spark, because we have no control, no matter what PG&E does with their shitty lines causing fires, we have no control over lightning strikes, and a fire can start anywhere. And when we manage through fire suppression, we essentially just delay the inevitable and make it orders of magnitude worse. This isn't something the Forest Service was willing to entertain for a great majority of its history. Thankfully, in recent years, because of the extreme fires we've seen, they've been somewhat more open to at least some other form of management, because what they're doing clearly isn't working. But what's hard is you're also having areas that people are living in that need to be managed through fire, and it's hard to have humans and fire living in the same space, at least today. Traditionally speaking, that was always our world. But that's because we were always, these things were going together, that fire as gentle care. The fire never consumed their world because they let it eat a little bit all the time, arguably. So let's see here. We're going to see how the Karuk do it. And what's cool about, I think they talk about in this one, but women firefighters in particular have been leading the way with this special knowledge. But let's see here.
Over the past few years, wildfires have gotten more destructive, more deadly. California is the epicenter of the wildfire epidemic. Over the past few years, wildfires have gotten more destructive, more deadly, and more expensive to put out. Many link this to climate change, but that's not the whole story.
Fire doesn't have to be scary.
Fire on our term is good. Fire not on our term could be bad and devastating.
Some believe that fighting fires has made things worse.
You're gonna fight fire, it's like, why don't you fight rain or fight earthquakes? It's just kind of this ridiculous idea.
The Karuk tribe in Northern California thinks the only solution is to embrace fire. Before European colonization, indigenous tribes practiced as a way to actually protect the forest from catastrophic wildfires.
Humans have been using fire as a management tool for millennia.
Prescribed fire is the most effective tool we have to prevent wildfires.
For over 100 years, federal and state policy has pushed to put out every fire at all costs. Now, the Karuk tribe is leading the movement to change that. They believe that both their land and their culture depend on it.
Our birthright was taken from us as fire people and fix the world people. And we're trying to restore that for the kids. We're playing catch up. We need to renew our relationship with fire. The clock is ticking.
Oh, bitch.
This game, you're not ready for it.
This is home. This is where my family's been since the beginning. And over the years, I just kind of watched it get thicker and thicker because of the laws there where we weren't allowed to treat it traditionally like our ancestors used to do. By prescribed fire, we were able to keep the invasive species out and keep the heavy fuel loading down to a minimum. So that way our resources like the elk, the bears, and the deer, they can still pass through the brush and the woods. We got away from some of that traditional knowledge. Now we're bringing it back.
Herman Alberts is the wildland fire operations specialist for the Karuk Fire and Fuels program.
Stiver, Albers. We are at the Stones workstation, getting things together. We'll see the crew when they get here.
His crew helps thin the forest by clearing the buildup of highly flammable brush and dead vegetation. They strategically gather it into piles away from larger trees, then they burn them. But these prescribed burns are an act of resistance. A 1911 federal policy made it illegal for people to start fires on public land. Another law said that all fires must be put out by 10 a.m. the following day. Fires temporarily decreased, but in turn, the forest thickened.
Reality is things right now are so out of balance simply because we've taken fire out of the landscape.
these forests are just tinderbox waiting to go, and we have to have fire on the landscape to keep catastrophic fire from destroying the landscape. We don't get our forest to accept fire, and we'll just keep losing these huge swaths of forest.
The tribe's ancestral territory spans over 1 million acres along the Klamath River in Humboldt and Siskiyou counties. But just like all other indigenous tribes in California, the Karuk don't have full jurisdiction over their land. So in order to legally implement prescribed burns, they must work in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service.
At 1.2 million acres that we want to treat and restore, and we can't do it alone. If we're trying to do it ourselves, it's going to take way too much time. We're never going to get ahead, or we're way behind right now.
Last year, the Forest Service signed a new implementation plan to support traditional Karuk burning practices. The plan was born out of the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, a historic collaboration between the Karuk tribe, the Forest Service, and other community stakeholders. They all agree on one thing: wildfires have gotten out of hand.
Wildfires have heavily impacted this landscape in ways that make me want to vomit and cry. Incredible sacred landscapes that have been gutted by high severity wildfire.
We're sort of the doctors treating the landscape, giving it their prescription to where they can be healthy again and grow and thrive. It scares me that it might not happen fast enough that I won't be able to witness it.
The government now admits that a century of misinformed fire suppression policy contributed to the wildfire epidemic in the state. And today, anti-fire policies and general public sentiment linger nationwide.
You know, with the passage of the Weeks Act in 1911, there was a zero tolerance policy for any kind of prescribed fire. And the reality is that everybody who lived here at that time used fire in one way or another. You know, the cattlemen, the ranchers, the gold miners, the tribal communities, all used fire as a tool.
But here's the thing: forest fires were a financial threat to the timber industry. The U.S. Forest Service was created in large part to secure a continuous timber supply for the American people. But for more than half a century, they implemented an aggressive fire suppression agenda.
Fire that roars up the valleys to the peaks, with burning, exploding, sweeping everything in its path, leaving nothing but gray ashes and charred stumps and dead animals, destroying millions of board feet of timber that we need to win the war. Another American tragedy, another careless, happy-go-lucky, patriotic American like you has made Hitler happy.
The Forest Service's advertising icon, Smokey Bear, became a household name, one with lasting effect on the American psyche.
Thanks to those who helped make America great. The next time you come to the forest, do me a favor. Only you only can prevent forest fire.
Only you can prevent forest fires was a constant reminder to Americans that all forest fires were bad. The end.
You own your own home in California, but still rent your electricity. For a limited time only, homeowners in specific zip codes who pay more than $70.
Just to be a Karuk, you're already illegal. If we just be ourselves, we're breaking all types of laws. Our hunting practices, our fishing practices, our burning practices. Maybe they could have continued with ceremonial fire, but maybe I wouldn't be here today because they would have been rubbed out, or they'd be doing 40 years in prison for arson.
It's the right of people to use fire as a tool, and people have resisted fire suppression at the risk of being thrown in prison. You know, this place in California is the hotbed of resistance against fire suppression policy.
As the Karuk tried to push for more prescribed burns, California wildfires continued to get worse. In 2018, over 1.6 million acres burned across the state. That includes Camp Fire, the deadliest and most destructive fire in California history, that killed 86 people and destroyed over 18,000 structures. While there is progress being made to implement prescribed burns, some say it's just not happening fast enough.
I'm not going to see the results of my work, and that's okay, because we don't do it for ourselves. You know, we do it out of this responsibility. I'm doing it because that's my job as a Karuk person. The thing I'm most afraid of is coming up short, not actually able to do the amount of work that needs to be done.
In 2018, the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership began a project to implement a 5,570-acre prescribed burn in Cottage territory. Across the entire United States, 11.3 million acres were treated with prescribed fire in 2017. But prescribed fires are still difficult to implement, especially in the West. This is due to weather limitations, air quality and smoke regulations, and the fear of liability lawsuits. California has the strictest air quality regulations in the country, and private properties are speckled throughout the state's mountains. Those homes are often protected at all costs, but at the same time, the Kaduk are worried about protecting their way of life.
For me, I came to it through, how do we protect a community from wildfires? Well, we use fire to fight fire. But for the tribal community, it's, how do we get the cultural materials to keep the culture alive, whether that's regalia or food or medicine, that all depend on fire.
My fear is, how do I continue being myself if I don't have these things? Whether it's salmon, a forest, how do I live? Maybe I'm still alive, but would you want to be if your landscape is completely gone? With regular burn intervals, it'll burn up into here. Eventually, another 50 years, this will be a huge tree and this will be a huge hole. And you could have quite a bit larger animal living in there. A little bit of fire isn't going to affect this nice hard part, but it'll make a nice home inside. Fire can create all this wonderful habitat that we've been sorely lacking, where this tree is begging for it.
Prescribed fires are already proving beneficial to traditional plants.
This is a wonderful little basket material. You see, you got your shade, all your trees didn't get totally new.
It'll just be wonderful, like, to liability there, and it hasn't even cut me or anything.
Some of the needles still here. It's not all ash and dust. So what that does is allow for the nutrients that are within these to go back into the soil and help promote this good growth of these shoots. Whereas if it was high intensity, all you would see is just pits of white ash everywhere. It's just decimated. It can't come back to its natural state without a lot of love and care and help from the people.
For the Kaduk, fire is a matter of survival. They worry that prescribed burns aren't happening at the scale that they need to be. Nearly 50% of Kaduk territory hasn't been touched by fire in the last 100 years. And because of that, it was left completely vulnerable.
We're doing good work here. Being a Food Tribal member, it has way more meaning to me to do this because this is what my ancestors did. And it's what was taken from them in the past. And we're going to make a movement. And you're going to hear about it all over the world. And it started right here.
So I was like, if we had time, I'd show you the one about the lady firefighters, but something they don't talk about. Firefighting, wildfire firefighting is one of the most dangerous occupations. But in many ways, it's because of this kind of era of catastrophic wildfires that we've seen in the last couple decades. But in many ways, one could imagine it no longer being that if there was a constant management of these same spaces with boots on the ground, using fire in the way you've just seen. Obviously, fire is always going to be a thing. And I know I keep talking about my dad. It's just one of those things that I heard my dad, he's got a lot of hateful shit he says. We don't agree on a lot of things. But he would talk about the piss firs, he called them, because of the little tree in the middle of the logo, and how they would, in this part of the world, a long time ago when fire suppression was still the policy, they would hire locals. And so it was like a way to make a living every season to do brushing crews, where instead of burning things down, they would go and clip it and take it somewhere. And there's no way we could ever cut it down in the way that fire would enable us. We just don't have, it's a matter of scale. We were given this tool by Creator, according to our belief systems, to care for these areas as such. And so much like many of our other teachings, it was taken from us, but thankfully you can see that there's this revival and this resurgence of this knowledge, this resilience of the knowledge. And so that's what I hope continues to kind of be the overarching theme for today and next time. Now, we won't really have lecture in terms of PowerPoint next time, but I just want to make a small point between here and there. Please go ahead and do the readings and make sure you catch 2 episodes of Reservation Dogs. You can see this on Hulu. I might do a screening if you don't have access to Hulu and won't be able to watch it any other way. I'd be happy to host a screening between now and Thursday, but most people have access to it. And if you're like, I have to watch it with my friend, I would love that actually. But no matter what, we want to get some of that under our belt because beyond the kind of examples I've just given you through food and through fire, there's other examples that we've already come across when it comes to Indigenous resilience and that we'll continue talking about next time. Native literature, art, and film. These have been vehicles both for healing, but also ways to keep things alive over time. There are also ways we might grapple with some really intense subjects. Here I've included some of my favorite poems. One of them is about methamphetamine or crank. I'll read that one. Crank. He had a beautiful smile. You know, the kind, like cream rising to the top, like shine on chrome, like bait on a hook. But that was before the shrunken face, the blanched skin, the picked sores, the protrusion of rotting teeth. Before the crank, he was a brush dancer. She was a weaver, put sticks and root in her hand and watched miracles unfold, like virgin apparitions, like gold rush survival, like old bones coming home. But that was before the parties all night, the sleeping around, the addiction, before the evolution of a bag hoe. He was unashamed. So what if he was attracted to men, like tides to the moon, like opposites, like fish to water? But that was before the dirty names, the condemnation, the family denial. Now it's better to be a druggie than an F-slur. She was a good mother, there for her kids, like t-ball games, like home-cooked meals, like showing up at school year events. But that was before the slinging crank, the instant cash, the hot jewelry, before she started killing her own people. They had pride, held on to the old ways, like hanging nets, like carving canoes, like stick games, and listening to elders. But that was before the crank, before they stopped giving a shit, before their culture started dying right in front of them. That one always hits me. I think I've shared with you guys before. The same dad I'm talking about started using meth at age 12 with grown men on these brush crews because it helped them do their job. But that's just how it was up in that part of the world. And in many ways, a lot of our ability to bring back this knowledge that will be potentially like saving the world hinges on our ability to save ourselves first and to heal the huge amount of trauma that's collected in these places. And only through our resilience will we have access to this knowledge, because it's not just our loss when this knowledge goes, it will be a loss to the entire world. It already has been in many ways. And so not to be like, and then there was a sociology reading. But yeah, there was. If you guys want to see how sociologists talk about resilience, you can take a look here. And I think what is most important about this reading for me is looking at resilience not as an individual trait, but rather a social product. That resilience is something that can actually be facilitated or stymied. That there are different ways resilience is kind of passed down across time and space through people, and that they kind of call this a social resilience. Now, next time, you're going to get to taste, smell, see, hear, and touch Indigenous resilience. So we're finishing up now, but if this is my last pitch to everyone listening, please come in person for Thursday's class. If for some reason you're not going to be there, let me know and we can make alternative plans. But I will say the Zoom experience just won't be the vibe, but it will be going on simultaneously. So thank you guys for your good listening. Make sure to check out, okay, I did say I was going to do a showing. So yeah, tomorrow at 8, I'm going to show it. I was like, couldn't remember if I put it in the syllabus or not. So yeah, if you guys want to watch it with me tomorrow, I'll be doing a screening of 2 episodes. But we're wrapping it now. If you're on Zoom, we're turning it off. I'm gonna say bye to the room. Thank you, everybody. Anyone in here got any room or questions before we say bye? All right.